So if we want to raise wealth, GDP, living standards in the UK, the focus has to be on raising the value for every hour worked in the UK in the global market where purchasing power is shifting to the east. And if you apply, therefore, a sort of strategic analysis to that in the way one would in business, I'd suggest there are 5 key areas that government ought to focus on to take forward a long-term view. And I'll run through each of these 5 quickly, but firstly, restructuring the public sector, secondly, promotion of savings, thirdly, reform of education, fourthly, promoting high-value service exports, and fifthly, and Joe will be glad to hear, securing low-cost energy. Let me explain briefly why I think each of those is particularly critical. Firstly, the public sector. 1 in 5 of the workforce in the UK currently works in the public sector. Despite all the efforts of reform, productivity growth, as measured by those bodies that try and measure it, has been minimal. The Office of National Statistics estimates there's been an average decline in productivity of the public sector of 3.4% between 1997 and 2007, without any equivalent increase in service. And the reasons, you can argue about the statistics, but I think we're all familiar with the difficulties of the public sector that is driven by top-down targets. It's not responsive to the market, there's little incentive to innovate or to reduce costs, and therefore it tends to stagnate rather than improve. And if the public sector had averaged 1.5% productivity growth in line with the rest of the economy, it would have added 0.3% a year to our total GDP growth. The government, I think, has got the right approach, which is wherever possible to separate the state as the funder of services from the state as the provider of services, so that provision is opened up to competition, to consumer pressure, to innovation. And it's actually quite common elsewhere in the UK. I mean, there seems to be thought to be fairly radical here, but if you look around much of Europe, for example, in France, 33% of hospital beds are provided by the private sector for the state-funded health service. 50% of beds in Germany are provided by the private sector for the state-funded social security system, and the same in private education. But in the UK, producer interests following nationalisation of these services 50-odd years ago has been heavily entrenched. The public are wary, and previous governments have backed away whenever they faced the sound of gunfire. So one can only hope that in both education and health and other sectors the government sticks to its guns, because the high productivity from that huge proportion of our economy in the public sector is probably the single biggest thing we can do to drive wealth creation and productivity growth, releasing manpower to be employed more effectively elsewhere. My second point was higher savings. One justification for increased savings, and I should declare I'm a director of Standard Life here, but one justification for increased savings is to support future retirement. There's a recent report for Aviva, the familiar song that if we wanted everyone to retire on 70% of their final salary, I mean that's quite a high figure, but the savings gap currently would be £300 billion a year, which is more than 20% of GDP. That's true, but I don't think it tells the whole story, because while it's true at an individual level, we want people to save for their retirement, at a macro level, the income going to the non-working population in future is simply a share of the income generated by those who at that time are still working. And whether it's achieved by dividends, taxes, sale of assets, or any other arrangement, doesn't change the fact that the retired population is going to be taking a large chunk of wealth being created by those active in the workforce at that future time. So I think a more fundamental reason to drive savings up is the fact that the more of current GDP we shift into savings, the more we shift into investment, that boosts future productivity growth, or if it's invested overseas, builds up overseas investment income. And this is one of these economic paradox is, since everyone knows in the short term higher savings reduces demand, and therefore we think we want people to spend, but I think that is a very short term view. Over the time the economy grows to move back to full employment, and the more we have in savings, the more we have investment, the higher the income that full employment will generate. And again, if you look internationally, gross savings as a percent of GDP for the UK over the last 20 years have averaged about 16%. That's not household savings, that's total economic savings, including the corporate sector. But that compares with advanced economies as a whole, where it's been 22%, emerging and developing economies, where it's been 27%, and the developing Asian economies, where it's been 36%. So, we are less than half the rate of savings and capital accumulation of those high growth economies, and it certainly hasn't done them any harm. The government, again, is sort of partly on the case. Their reforms to raise the base state pension so that everyone knows that they won't lose out by saving, by losing benefits, I think are an important and quite brave step. The continuation of the implementation of Nest, even though it may not be good for all the small businesses, I think is nevertheless an important step in building in a savings culture. There's compulsory enrolment in pensions. But the trouble is, savings in this country and the tax incentives are far too complex. And I think if we really want to incentivise savings, we have to simplify it to a simple notion that money you put away in savings isn't taxed anymore. And the best way to achieve that would be a massive expansion in the ISA approach, which does exactly that. To enable people to switch retirement savings from a conventional pension with all the complications of locking it in and having to reach this age and then annuitising and all the rest of it, to making their retirement savings in an ISA vehicle where you pay a tax, but then you get tax-free income at the end. And this is something I explain over and over again to politicians and Treasury officials, that for most taxpayers, whether or not you get the tax relief up front in a pension or you get the tax relief in the end in an ISA is completely irrelevant. The net present value of the two is exactly the same for most taxpayers. The difference is that ISAs are highly popular because they're much more flexible, you can get the access if you need. There are 19 million ISA accounts, the majority of which are held by people on less than median earnings, because people understand it and they like the flexibility. And most of them aren't spent the next year, most of them are accumulated for the long term. But for some reason the government caps ISA savings at 10,600 and whatever it is this year. So my modest suggestion to George Osborne is that if he wants a 50k annual pension allowance in the UK, he should allow that 50k to be put in an ISA rather than restricting it to a pension contribution. It'd make retirement savings much more attractive, and it would actually save the government money because in the short term, because every time somebody puts money in a pension, the government has to fork out the tax relief now. If they put an ISA, that tax relief is deferred 20 years in the future. And there's something like 20 or 30 billion pounds a year spent on pension tax relief. I'm not suggesting we abolish that, I think that would be too draconian, but even if you could encourage people to switch half of that and add to it, you'd save a lot of money and increase the savings ratio. So I think a radical approach to really driving up savings in the UK is essential. My third point